So we are recording today's session, and you're in for a great treat. I'm going to introduce our faculty members that are with us today, Dr. Brian Smith and Dr. Debbie Hutchins. They will be facilitating the talk, and so I will turn everything over to them.
Okay, welcome. Welcome one and all. Big Texas welcome to those of you outside of the Lone Star State. Welcome to South Texas College. My name is Brian Smith. I'm a teacher here at South Texas College in the Department of Political Science. Today we're hosting this virtual talk from the Rio Grande Valley, which for those of you who don't know, has the fun geographical and political fact of being far south of Mexico. Our speaker today, however, is coming to us from Loyola University, which is in Maryland on the east coast of the United States, just north of Washington, just north of Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Last, but in no way least, is of course, our audience, which is, of course, primarily comprised of students and faculty here at South Texas College. I know, however, we also have members from our local Weslaco Museum, as well as staff from our college's HR department. Our audience, however, reaches far beyond this college and region. We not only have audience members tuning in from across the valley in Texas, but we also have audience members tuning in from across the United States, internationally from Canada. Welcome to Professor Altakos and his students from Guelph University. That's in Ontario, Canada, and indeed from across the globe. Some of my former students are joining us from Southern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So a quick shout out to all of my current and former students here in the Rio Grande Valley and from around the world. Welcome. Welcome also to all of those of you I don't know. Welcome one and all. We're electronically gathered here today to celebrate Black History Month in order to celebrate a great American, Frederick Douglass. Douglass exemplifies in many ways the highest and the best of the American tradition. Douglass fought for freedom and equality. He was remarkably principled, strong, intelligent, a gentleman whose virtues are all the more shining because he's self-made. I could go on praising the virtues of Frederick Douglass, but that would delay the time we're privileged from spending with today's speaker. Today, we are truly honored to be listening to Professor Diana Schaub. As mentioned, Professor Schaub is a professor of political science at Loyola University, Maryland, a visiting scholar in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Department at the American Enterprise Institute. She was the Garwood Teaching Fellow at Princeton University in 2011 and 2012, and a visiting professor of political theory in the Government Department at Harvard University in 2018 and 2020. She's the author of a book on Montesquieu, along with many scholarly articles in the fields of political philosophy and American political thought. She is a co-author, co-editor, along with the famous Amy and Leon Cass of What So Proudly We Hail, the American Soul in Story, Speech, and Song. And for those of you who don't know this great book, it's a very helpful book for those who want to understand why the ordinary in American life is extraordinary. This book is part of the South Texas College Library collection. The website, What So Proudly We Hail, duplicates this treasure trove electronically. So I highly recommend it. Professor Schaub is also a member of the board of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Institute. She also sits on the publication committee of national affairs and has a new book on Lincoln forthcoming from St. Martin's Press in 2021. Truly, this is an honor for our humble college to be graced by such a first-rate scholar and lady. Speaking for myself, I'm very excited and grateful to hear Professor Schaub's argument and analysis of what is a very exciting and historic American speech. Please give a loud appreciative, albeit virtual, South Texas welcome to Professor Diana Shaw.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm delighted to have received this invitation and a chance to see Brian again. I first met him when he was a graduate student, so it's been a few years since we've seen one another. I'm also very happy to be speaking to you in the month of February. As we all know, February is a month of important birthdays. This past Monday, the 22nd, was George Washington's birthday. And earlier in the month, on the 12th and the 14th, we had the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Because of the coincidence of these three birthdays in the same month, February is when we celebrate both President's Day and Black History Month. And interestingly, Lincoln has a place in both holidays. Washington's birthday was declared a federal holiday in 1885, and then in 1971, its observance was moved from the actual day to the third Monday in February. And as a result of that, the holiday is now frequently understood as honoring both Washington and Lincoln, as the used car commercials and mattress sales festooned with their images reveal. What we now call Black History Month began nearly a century ago in 1926 as Negro History Week. The second week in February was chosen because of Lincoln's birthday on the 12th and Frederick Douglass's birthday on the 14th. At the time, many Black communities had a tradition of celebrating those two birthdays together in acknowledgement of the role each man played in the dramatic transformation of Black life. Lincoln because he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and Douglass because of his work as an abolitionist before the Civil War and then as a civil rights leader after the war. The African-American historian Carter Woodson, who had the idea for Negro History Week, wanted to expand those existing celebrations of Lincoln and Douglass to include the subsequent record of Black achievement and to invite the entire nation to share in learning about the place of the Black struggle within American history. I intend my lecture tonight as a bridge between Black History Month and President's Day. My text for the evening will be Frederick Douglass's 1876 oration in memory of Abraham Lincoln. It's a speech that presents Douglass's assessment of Lincoln's character and statesmanship. Now, these are matters over which there is still much contention. The recent 1619 Project, for instance, takes a strongly anti-Lincoln line. Now, perhaps this should not be surprising. After all, there was never very much appreciation of Lincoln from the radical wing of his own party during his administration. Radicals then and now have been particularly stinting in their praise of Lincoln. Some today suggest that the credit for emancipation belongs to those like Frederick Douglass, who pressured Lincoln to take that decisive step. At the extreme, this position asserts that Lincoln was anti-Black, that the Emancipation Proclamation was basically a fraud, and that Lincoln does not deserve any credit since he was forced into glory. However, before signing on to that radical critique, we might want to examine what the greatest of the abolitionists himself had to say about Lincoln. From his newspaper editorials before and during the war, to his speeches and personal reminiscences after the war, the trajectory of Frederick Douglass's thinking about Lincoln is one of increasing and deepening appreciation, often revising his own earlier negative assessments. Perhaps because Douglass was self-educated, self-made, he remained a lifelong learner, capable of open-minded and rigorous reconsiderations. The way in which the exercise of his critical faculties could lead him to substantive revaluations was evident early in his career when he dramatically changed his opinion about the status of slavery under the Constitution. Although he had at first joined his fellow abolitionists in viewing the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, he came to see that interpretation as grossly misleading. And in 1851, Douglass embraced an anti-slavery reading of the Constitution. And by doing so, he transformed himself from a revolutionary intent on annulling the Constitution into a reformer, still fiercely critical of American failings, but ever after a staunch defender of America's founding principles. A parallel but more subtle shift occurred as a result of Douglas's encounter with Lincoln. That encounter, I think, taught him to appreciate the statesman, which is to say the prudent politician, as well as to appreciate the John Browns of the world. Douglas learned to love Lincoln, and in his 1876 oration in memory of Lincoln, he recapitulated that intellectual and emotional journey for the benefit of all Americans. Douglas's oration was delivered as the keynote address at the unveiling of the nation's first statue in honor of Lincoln. The statue is entitled Emancipation, and it was erected in the name of the former slaves, and it was paid for entirely through their donations. The funds were raised just pennies and nickels at a time. As befitted the ceremonial nature of the occasion, Douglas's speech expressed gratitude toward Lincoln. But more intriguingly, the speech reflected on the political significance of gratitude. So it is a speech both of gratitude and about gratitude. Douglas says that the sentiment of gratitude, which perpetuates the memories of great public men, is one of the noblest that can stir and thrill the human heart. Further, he points out that with the dedication of the Freedmen's Monument, Black Americans now, quote, for the first time in the history of our people, join in this high worship. Douglas wants the world to notice what we, the colored people, are doing in honoring Abraham Lincoln. As he explains, first things are always interesting, and this is one of our first things. So Douglas presents the Black commemoration of Lincoln as an act that honors the honorers almost as much as it honors the honoree. The story of how the Freedmen's Memorial took the shape it did, and Douglas's role in ensuring that his people's first national act came off well, is fascinating. Douglas was asked in 1865, shortly after the assassination of Lincoln, to lend his name to the Educational Monument Association, which proposed to raise money from Blacks and whites to build a Black college in honor of Lincoln's memory. Douglas refused to participate in the project. And here's what he wrote in his letter to the organizers. This is a kind of paragraph length long quote. Here's what he says. For a monument by itself and upon its own merits, I say good. For a college by itself and upon its own merits, I say good. But for a college monument or for a monument college, I do not say good. The whole scheme is derogatory to the character of the colored people of the United States. It looks to me like an attempt to wash the Black man's face in the nation's tears for Abraham Lincoln. I am for washing the Black man's face, that is, educating his mind, for that is a good thing to be done. And I appreciate the nation's tears for Abraham Lincoln, but I'm not so enterprising as to think of turning the nation's veneration for our martyred president into a means of advantage to the colored people and of sending around the hat to a mourning public. So Douglas doesn't want gratitude to be contaminated with self-interest, blatant self-interest. Gratitude, you could argue, isn't even gratitude then. In the proposed college monument, the problem of impure motives would be even worse, because there wouldn't just be a mixture of motives, there would actually be a division of motives along racial lines. Whites would be doing the giving and Blacks the self-interested taking. So Douglas doesn't want his people to enter upon citizenship in that way. Instead of an ennobling display of Black gratitude, a display that would elevate the givers and moreover elevate the givers in the minds of white observers, the college monument idea would reduce Blacks primarily to the role of recipients. Now, it should be said that Douglas was not in principle opposed to philanthropy, even white philanthropy on behalf of Blacks. Years earlier, he had in fact sketched a plan for a college, an industrial college, in answer to an inquiry from Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote him saying, what could she do to further Black advancement? And he proposed this idea of an industrial college. However, Douglass was always sensitive to the dangers of ill-timed or overly intrusive assistance. He thought it could have a perverse effect, sapping Black initiative and thereby actually impeding the long-term prospects of the race. So Douglass worried that there was always more of benevolence and pity rather than straightforward justice in white America's dealings with Blacks. His preference was for justice, sternly and blindly equal, with no special pleadings or privileges. This leads to what at first might seem a contradiction in Douglass's reaction to the Monument College project. As is well known, I think, Douglass's vision of America is fundamentally integrationist. Nonetheless, he wants the monument to Lincoln, to be exclusively a Black effort. However humble, he says, it should be our own act and deed. On the other hand, when it comes to the idea of a college, Douglass speaks not only against the self-serving hybrid of a monument college, but also against the idea of any college being built for the permanent and exclusive use of Blacks. Now, given the discrimination of the day, Douglass admitted that you need to kind of have temporary recourse to what he called compluxional institutions. But he didn't want to see the building of any institution that accepted the permanence of segregation. As he says, the American people must stand each for all and all for each, without respect to color or race. So he's in favor of a separately erected monument, but opposed to a separate college. Why a freedman's memorial, but not a freedman's college? What accounts for his different judgment on these two endeavors? The explanation, I think, hinges on the nature of the two undertakings and their potential contribution to either lessening racial prejudice or prolonging the period of prejudice. A display of gratitude by Black Americans reflecting on the special sentiments that they bear towards Lincoln would undercut white prejudice by showing Blacks capable of the holiest sentiments of the human heart, that sentiment of gratitude. Conversely, a college explicitly and exclusively reserved to Blacks, whoever foots the bill for it, by accommodating race prejudice, in effect bolsters it, strengthens it. Thus, Douglass accepts all Black institutions only with great reluctance and always with the proviso that as soon as circumstances permit, Blacks must make their way into the majority institutions. So I think Douglass is consistent. He judges instances of racial solidarity and group action by their effects on friendship between the races. So his guiding question is always, does the doing of this deed point us toward the overcoming of racism and contribute to an ethos of common citizenship? Acts of Black self-reliance, both individual acts and group-based ones, can create the conditions for non-racial or transracial brotherhood. Douglass understood, I think, that before the Black man could be recognized as a brother, he must be recognized as a man. Manliness precedes fraternity, or we want to put this in a non-gendered formulation, independence precedes friendship. As Douglass hoped, the Monument College plan was abandoned, and in the end, the memorial took the pure form that he had recommended, and Douglass himself delivered the keynote address. Not surprisingly, his first paragraph refers to the manly pride with which Blacks should view the occasion, while the final paragraph sets forth the Black claim to human brotherhood. More especially, Douglass informs those whites who sought to scourge Blacks beyond the range of human brotherhood that the Freedmen's Monument stands as the refutation of their blighting slander. In between his opening invocation of manliness or independence and the closing invocation of brotherhood or friendship, the speech itself demonstrates how a still very divided nation could develop a shared perspective on the achievements of Abraham Lincoln. Any analysis of the speech must take into account not only the uniqueness of the occasion, but the rhetorical dilemma posed by the larger historical moment. The speech was given in 1876. The Reconstruction period was coming to an end. The federal government was increasingly reluctant to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Citizenship and the Suffrage Amendments. Douglas was very worried, and rightly worried, about the resurgent spirit of the Old South. Douglas worried that reconciliation between Northern whites and Southern whites could end up excluding the freedmen and erasing the real meaning of the Civil War. Thus, he attempts to use the memory of Lincoln to counteract that dangerous tendency and basically to revive the new birth of freedom. The oration that he gives has a very careful structure. It's composed of 8 distinct sections, and each of those sections begins with what the grammarians call a vocative expression. In the first 2 sections, he addresses friends and fellow citizens. In the subsequent 6 sections, simply fellow citizens. Now, we know that politicians rely on direct address of this sort. Sometimes it even becomes a kind of verbal tick. Think about Lyndon Johnson in his Texas accent, which I cannot imitate, but many of you are familiar with it. And Lyndon Johnson peppered all of his speeches with "my fellow Americans." Douglas's iterations, friends and fellow citizens, and sometimes just fellow citizens, his repetition of that phrase, I think, is much more deliberate, and he always puts that in to signal a new phase of an argument. And this argument delineates the different but not irreconcilable claims of whites and blacks to the memory of Lincoln. Douglas begins the oration by addressing the immediate audience, those who assembled that day in Lincoln Park, due east of the Capitol building, on the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. The audience was a large one, and it was a racially mixed one. There were about 25,000 ordinary citizens, along with numerous representatives of official Washington. Douglas mentions the presence of members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, presence of the Chief Justice and the Supreme Court, the entire Supreme Court, and the presence of President Grant himself. Those attendees deserve to be called not just fellow citizens, but friends. Friends. Their attendance at the event gave evidence of their sympathies. Interestingly, this first section of the speech makes no mention at all of Lincoln, but instead congratulates you, a pronoun that seems to refer, at least initially, only to Douglas's fellow blacks. So he speaks of our condition as a people and the progress, remarkable progress in that condition. The evidence of progress, Douglas says, is a credit to American civilization, and that provides the occasion for him to shift to congratulating not just you, the Black attendees, but all. Douglas notes that the new dispensation of freedom has come both to our white fellow citizens and ourselves. The second section of the speech acknowledges especially the federal government and the role that the federal government has played in this new order of things. The erection of the memorial actually received congressional approval, and the pedestal for the statue was paid for by congressional appropriation. So the freed slaves paid for the statue itself, but the pedestal was paid for by the federal government. And the day, the unveiling of the statue, that day was set aside as a federal holiday. Douglas goes on to highlight the awful sacrifice that lies behind that federal friendship. This section contains Douglas's first mention of Lincoln, and he calls Lincoln the first martyr president of the United States. Moreover, Lincoln's martyrdom is presented as the climax of a larger national sacrifice, which Douglas alludes to by referring to yonder heights of Arlington. Arlington Cemetery was visible from Lincoln Park, and 16,000 Civil War soldiers were buried there, including 1,500 Black troops. So on the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's death, what Douglas wanted to remind his audience of was blood-bought freedom, our blood-bought freedom, in which, quote, we, the colored people, rejoice. While Douglas emphasizes the sentiment of gratitude and appreciation that gives rise to monuments, like the one being unveiled, curiously, he says nothing about the actual statue. And it is known that he was not altogether pleased with the design. The design shows Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation in one hand, standing above or over the crouching or half-rising figure of a slave. Dissatisfaction with the sculpture was apparently not limited to Douglas. It was shared by other African Americans. The official program for the festivities attempted to address these objections. So the official program that was handed out the day of the event explains, quote, in the original design, the kneeling slave was represented as perfectly passive, receiving freedom from the hand of the great liberator. But the artist justly changed this to bring the presentation nearer to the historical fact by making the emancipated slave an agent in his own deliverance. He is accordingly represented as exerting his own strength with strained muscles in breaking the chain which had bound him. It's the end of the quote from the brochure. Now, the brochure also mentions that there was an alternative design by a female sculptor, Harriet Hosmer. It had to be rejected as too costly. But that design would have depicted Lincoln atop a central pillar, flanked by smaller pillars, showing, among other figures, Black Union soldiers. Douglas, I think, would certainly have preferred that design. That design embodied his favorite aphorism. It's an aphorism that he cited in speech after speech. These are lines from Lord Byron, and the aphorism goes like this: hereditary bondsmen, know ye not, who would be free themselves must strike the blow. In a sense, I think you could say that Douglas's speech corrects the submissiveness or paternalism of the statue, because Douglas makes a point of acknowledging both our loyal, brave, and patriotic soldiers and the vast, high, and preeminent services rendered to ourselves, to our race, to our country, and to the whole world by Abraham Lincoln. In other words, Douglas's praise of Lincoln is balanced by his recognition of Black agency, the invaluable contribution made by Black Union troops. And remember, by the end of the war, there were 180,000 Black troops. So, having spent the opening two sections proclaiming the generous deed of the moment and commending it to the notice of men of all parties and opinions, including, he says, those who despise us, Douglas, in the third section, begins to speak to the larger nationwide audience. Douglas was very aware that this would be the largest audience he would ever speak to, that this speech would be reprinted in newspapers throughout the land. And I think that's why he shifts from saying friends and fellow citizens to just saying fellow citizens. He now knows that he is speaking to people, not all of whom are necessarily friends. And Douglas now treads very carefully. He does not want the Black embrace of Lincoln to trigger a white flight from Lincoln. And so he quite dramatically backs away from the great emancipator. Here's what he says. Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model in his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices. He was a white man. He was primarily the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the last years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity in the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of his country. The race to which we belong were not the special objects of his consideration. Knowing this, I concede to you, my white fellow citizens, a preeminence in this worship at once full and supreme. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. Douglas devotes the whole of section 3 to reassuring nervous whites who are patriotic, but probably prejudiced. Basically, he tells them, look, don't worry, Lincoln always loved you best. Take it from me, a Negro, Lincoln was not a Negro lover. It's a rather startling rhetorical gambit, but it allowed Douglas to exhort white Americans to heap high their hosannas of Lincoln. He tells them, to you, it belongs especially to sound his praises, to preserve and perpetuate his memory, to multiply statues, to hang his pictures on your walls, and commend his example, for to you, he was a great and glorious friend and benefactor. By the close of this section of the speech, which we might dub the white supremacist section, one might wonder, why blacks are bothering to honor Lincoln at all? Douglas's answer is that while whites are Lincoln's children, blacks are his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by force of circumstances and necessity. Moreover, what Lincoln did for his stepchildren, whether it was part of his original intention or not, was deliver them from bondage. Accordingly, Douglas entreats whites to despise not the humble offering of former slaves. The separate claims of whites and blacks upon the memory of Lincoln can coexist. Whites can honor Lincoln for saving the Union. Blacks can honor him for emancipation. Shared homage, if it is ever to develop, must begin with toleration for racially specific homage. Frederick Douglass had a gift for metaphor, and this image of blacks as Lincoln's stepchildren, I think, is one of his finest metaphors. It actually accords very nicely with Lincoln's own account of the relationship between the cause of union and the cause of emancipation. He expresses this relationship in his famous letter to Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune. Here's how Lincoln explained his duty as president. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Douglas reminds his listeners that Lincoln was a Unionist, first and foremost, and that he became the great emancipator only by force of circumstances and necessity. Whites ought to revere Lincoln as the savior of the nation. And indeed, the inscription on the National Lincoln Memorial, which was built half a century after the Freedmen's Memorial, reads, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." Of course, the Union to which Lincoln was devoted had at its foundation the principle of human equality. So the Union was itself a moral project. Because the bond of genuine union is a teaching about natural right, American patriotism ought to produce citizens who are, as Douglas says, friendly to the freedom of all men. In the fourth and central section of the speech, Douglas presents at great length the stepchildren's view of Lincoln, the essential feature of which was faith in Lincoln's earnest and living. Let me get that quote right. The essential feature of which was faith in Lincoln's living and earnest sympathy with their fate. Again, Douglas doesn't paper over the disagreements and the disappointments that Blacks experienced during the war years. We were, he admits, at times stunned, grieved, and greatly bewildered. Douglas provides a litany of reasons why Blacks might have doubted Lincoln's goodwill. Lincoln supported colonization schemes. He refused at first to enlist Black troops. After he finally allowed Black recruitment, he refused to retaliate when the Confederates violated the rules of warfare by massacring Black prisoners. And he revoked early emancipation decrees by Union generals in the field. Douglas lists all of those reasons to be disappointed in Lincoln. Nonetheless, Douglas goes on to assert that we were able to take a comprehensive view of Abraham Lincoln, a view that took the measure of a man. And after factoring in the logic of events and even the divinity that shapes our ends, quote from Douglas, the divinity that shapes our ends, Douglas says, quote, we came to the conclusion that the hour and the man of our redemption had met in the person of Abraham Lincoln. Douglas then goes on to give a counter litany of the liberationist and racially transformative policies that occurred under Lincoln's administration. He lists 9 achievements culminating in the Emancipation Proclamation. And each time he repeats a version of the phrase, under his rule we saw. That phrase, I think, is crucial for both Blacks and whites. Under his rule we saw. Blacks who longed for liberty, but who might understandably be suspicious of rule and law, having suffered under generations, centuries of misrule. They are being reminded that their liberty came to them through law and through wise and beneficent rule. It's another quote from Douglas, wise and beneficent rule. Conversely, whites are being reminded that the actions of Lincoln, which struck not only at slavery, but struck at prejudice and proscription, those actions were the actions of a dedicated constitutionalist. The closing paragraph of Section 4 celebrates emancipation and, moreover, shows that that celebration can be and should be shared by all. So Douglas asks, quote, can any colored man or any white man friendly to the freedom of all men ever forget the night which followed the first day of January 1863, the day at which the Emancipation Proclamation took effect? Whites can appreciate Black liberation, and Blacks can appreciate white statesmanship. And this word, statesmanship, is a word that now Douglas uses for the first, but not the last time in the address. On this new biracial basis of union and liberty, Douglas goes on to a reconsideration of Lincoln in sections 5, 6, and 7. He argues that Lincoln's great and good character was transparent to all who saw him and heard him. Indeed, direct contact wasn't even necessary. In a passage that I think has tremendous import for us today, Douglas says, the image of the man went out with his words, and those who read him knew him. We are indebted to biographers and historians who have scoured and scavenged for all the bits and pieces of eyewitness testimony and hearsay evidence, and who have laboriously contextualized and hypothesized and speculated to such a degree that, with the exception of Jesus, there is now no one who ever walked the earth more written about than Abraham Lincoln. Nonetheless, it's reassuring to know that Lincoln's words alone are enough. In other words, you don't have to read any of those secondary sources. Just read Lincoln, just read Douglas. In light of this fundamentalist insight, Douglas now revises his earlier white supremacist account of Lincoln. He reconsiders Lincoln's deference to popular prejudice in the appropriate context, the context of democratic statesmanship. And here's what he says at the close of section 5. This is another long passage from Douglas. I have said that President Lincoln was a white man and shared the prejudices common to his countrymen towards the colored race. Looking back to his times and to the condition of the country, this unfriendly feeling on his part may safely be set down as one element of his wonderful success in organizing the loyal American people for the tremendous conflict before them and bringing them safely through that conflict. His great mission was to accomplish two things. First, to save his country from dismemberment and ruin. And second, to free his country from the great crime of slavery. To do one or the other or both, he must have the earnest sympathy and the powerful cooperation of his loyal fellow countrymen. Without this primary and essential condition to success, his efforts must have been vain and utterly fruitless. Had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, he would have inevitably driven from him a powerful class of the American people and rendered resistance to rebellion impossible. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Frederick Douglass himself always occupied the genuine abolition ground, and his speeches and writings from the early years of the war especially often manifested great frustration with Lincoln's caution, slow pace. In retrospect, however, Douglass generously acknowledges the partiality of his own abolitionist stance, and he credits Lincoln as the comprehensive statesman. I think it's important to note that the final paragraph of this section carefully distinguishes Lincoln's views on race from his views on slavery. Douglass repeats for the third time that Lincoln was prejudiced, or more precisely, that he shared the prejudices of his white fellow countrymen against the Negro. According to Douglass, racial prejudice is a social construct. There's nothing innate or inevitable about it. It seems that Douglass does not regard Lincoln as particularly progressive on this question of race. He was a follower or a sharer in the dominant opinion of the day. However, in the very same section in which Douglass refers to Lincoln's prejudices, he explicitly says that the humblest could approach Lincoln and feel at home in his presence. The statement echoes what Douglass said elsewhere about the experience of actually being in Lincoln's personal presence. Speaking of his second meeting with Lincoln, Douglass in his own biography says, Mr. Lincoln was not only a great president, he was a great man. Too great to be small in anything. In his company, I was never in any way reminded of my humble origin or of my unpopular color. We might wonder whether the presentation of Lincoln's racial prejudice is compatible with the presentation of his capacious, his welcoming humanity. Of course, it might be possible for someone to regard a particular class of people as inferior in certain respects, while still treating individual members of that class with consideration. Lincoln could have been both prejudiced and polite. If so, it would still be necessary to explain why Douglas in the oration chooses to draw attention to one quality more than the other. Perhaps he wishes to indicate to both blacks and whites that racial prejudice, which he knows is widespread at this time, that racial prejudice is not an insuperable obstacle to black advancement or to bettered race relations, at least race relations in the course of betterment. Alternatively, I believe it's possible to interpret Douglas's remarks in a way consistent with the view that Lincoln deferred to popular prejudice without fully subscribing to that prejudice himself. So the issue here might be elucidated by asking, what was the nature of Lincoln's sharing in white prejudice? When he describes the relation between Lincoln and the sentiment of his country, Douglas credits Lincoln with actually being in advance of popular opinion. Right? Measured against popular opinion, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Douglas introduces this key verb, consult, claiming that the sentiment of his country was something Lincoln was bound as a statesman to consult. To the extent that popular sentiment was unfriendly to blacks, Lincoln's sharing in it may have been political rather than personal. In other words, deliberately affected rather than deeply held. Douglas here, I think, is conveying a crucial lesson about the limits within which democratic statesmen operate. Politicians can't get too far ahead of public opinion if they hope to remain politically viable. More than others, perhaps, Black citizens have to incorporate that insight into their assessment of political figures. A comprehensive view must make reasonable allowance for the circumstances and not judge, Douglas says, on the basis of stray utterances or isolated facts. In taking the measure of Lincoln, Douglas shows how granting that latitude of maneuver is compatible with respect for the burdens of statesmanship as well as the self-respect of citizens. So you could say that what Douglas is trying to do is model what it looks like to take a comprehensive view of a politician. His people are new voters, and there are two dangers that they have to avoid. Douglas doesn't want blacks to look to politics for a Moses figure. He doesn't want to turn Lincoln into a Moses figure. But he also doesn't want his people to fall into the opposite error of cynically seeing only flaws. He shows the possibility, I think, of appreciation without idolatry and criticism without rejection. Now, whichever way one wants to come down on this question of Lincoln's views on race, Douglas is emphatic that Lincoln's attitude towards slavery was above reproach. Douglas quotes from what I call the atonement passage of the Second Inaugural, that passage in which Lincoln interpreted the Civil War as the blood price exacted by a just God for the nation's sins towards the slave. You remember the passage speaks about the war possibly continuing until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be repaid with another drawn with the sword. Now, those were lines that Douglas quoted in nearly every post-war speech he gave that mentioned Lincoln. The Second Inaugural's solemn invocation of divine reparations, Douglas says, gives all needed proof of Lincoln's feeling on the subject of slavery. Douglas now revisits an issue that he had highlighted earlier in Section 3, when he mentioned Lincoln's policy of opposition to the extension of slavery. He had stressed Lincoln's willingness to protect, defend, and perpetuate slavery in the states where it existed. This tolerance of slavery in the South was initially cited by Douglas as evidence of Lincoln's pro-white views. But now in Section 5, Douglas explains that Lincoln acted as he did, not because he was indifferent to the fate of black slaves, but because he thought it was so nominated in the bond. In other words, he acted out of fidelity to the Constitution as he understood it. Lincoln's pre-war willingness to leave slavery alone in the southern states does not in any way disprove or lessen his anti-slavery convictions. Now, Douglas himself actually disagreed with Lincoln about what precisely the Constitution required. Most notably, Douglas argued that the so-called fugitive slave clause of the Constitution did not, in fact, refer to slaves. Douglas argued that it referred to indentured servants who had signed contracts for labor, and they could be held to those terms, those legal terms. Nonetheless, even though T. Douglas is not fully in accord with Lincoln's reading of the document, Douglas is trying to move his audience towards an appreciation of constitutional devotion. I think he's acutely aware that racial progress in the future will depend upon the fidelity of both Blacks and whites to the Constitution, that Constitution as purified and completed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. All right, this brings us to sections 6 and 7. We're nearing the end of the speech here. Those sections transcend race altogether. These are the only sections that make no reference to either Blacks or whites. Section 6 describes Lincoln's early years, his preparation for the great crisis of Civil War, his character. Douglas emphasizes Lincoln's humble origins. He calls him a son of toil who was linked in brotherly sympathy with the sons of toil in every loyal part of the Republic. In this section, racial division is overcome, and it's replaced by the class division between the patrician James Buchanan, President James Buchanan, who was willing to allow national dismemberment, the difference between him, and the plebeian, the son of toil, Abraham Lincoln, who had an oath in heaven to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So the division that we ought to dwell on, Douglas implies, is that between patriotism and treason. This theme reaches its apotheosis in section 7, which describes the assassination. Despite the hell-black spirit of revenge that motivated the crime, Douglas argues that good has come from it. Dying as a martyr to union and liberty, these twin aims now conjoined and equal, Lincoln has become doubly dear to us. In his autobiography, Douglas noted that one effect of the assassination was to bring him into close accord with his white neighbors. He said it actually made him feel for the first time that he was more like kin than countrymen. In the final section of the speech, which is just one paragraph in length, Douglas comes full circle, speaking once again to his largely Black audience. And he tells them, in doing honor to the memory of our friend and liberator, we have been doing highest honor to ourselves and those who come after us. Note that despite the unfriendly feeling ascribed to Lincoln in sections 3 and again in section 5, by the end of the speech, Lincoln has become our friend. Through his interpretation, through his masterful presentation of Lincoln's statesmanship, Douglas has tried to knit together the American polity in mutual understanding and mutual appreciation of Lincoln. Douglas, I would argue, has acted as a statesman himself by demonstrating how memory and memorialization done well might shape a better American future. Now, in conclusion, let me just say a word about the larger lesson to be drawn from this speech. Frederick Douglass is best known as an activist. Much of his speaking and writing involved demands for justice. There's a famous story. Douglass is an old man. Young man comes up to him and says, "What can I do for the cause of racial justice?" And the elderly Douglass is said to have said, "Agitate, agitate, agitate." However, this fabled agitator also devoted a goodly portion of his public speaking to commemorating the past, celebrating the founding ideals, praising public figures who remain faithful to the Declaration and the Constitution. Thinking of wrapping this up a little bit sooner, I got a little section here on Aristotle that I might just leave out. Let me just go to the current moment, especially in our contemporary moment.
protests over the past summer erupted over incidents of racial injustice, as well as over statues and memorials that are thought to symbolize and contribute to ongoing injustice. I can't think of a better resource than Frederick Douglass. He's one of the nation's greatest fighters against injustice, and he took very seriously this topic of public commemoration. It matters intensely who we memorialize and how we understand our past. I think there are things that distinguish Douglass from today's protesters and progressives. Douglass was certainly a fierce critic of our national transgressions, but he also believed deeply in the American project. He considered the principles of the Declaration of Independence to be saving principles. He considered the Constitution to be a great liberty document. He criticized the nation from the perspective of our own highest ideals. He called us to live up to our professions. He could be bitingly satirical, but he was never cynical. He was always ready to find and praise what was good and generous and true in the American experiment. And I'm very worried that this spirit of gratitude is being lost. There's a very deep alienation expressed in much contemporary rhetoric and action. And last summer, this hostility went so far as to threaten the Freedmen's Monument itself with destruction or removal. And I just read today that Eleanor Holmes Norton has reintroduced legislation in Congress to remove the Freedmen's Monument from Lincoln Park. There are many reasons to preserve the monument, including that it was the site of one of Douglass's most significant speeches, and that it marks what Douglass called his people's first national act, the act by which they translated their gratitude for emancipation into an enduring work of art. The controversy over the monument will be salutary if it leads us to revisit its history and reread Douglass's speech. I think he can help us towards a more thoughtful and nuanced patriotism. Thank you very much for your patience.
Wow, thank you. That was.
Let's get to the questions.
Fantastic. Yes, that was absolutely fantastic. Yes, we'd like to open the floor to questions for Professor Schaub. We had one question earlier, but I wasn't altogether clear on it. It was from Sandra Charles. Sandra Charles asked, what led Douglass to his movement? Was he triggered by an event from his youth?
Well, I guess I'm a little uncertain too, what is meant by movement. I mean, does that just mean what made him an abolitionist? Or does he mean the shift, the movement in his sort of assessment of Lincoln? If it means what made him an abolitionist, I take it that it's because he was a slave and understood the wrongfulness of slavery. He is absolutely committed to that cause. But, I'm in a way more interested in these shifts in his opinions, both the shift in his opinion moving from a pro-slavery reading of the Constitution to an anti-slavery reading of the Constitution, and then his sort of shift or reassessment of Lincoln, coming to appreciate prudence. So,
yes, it was the Sandra was interested in the shift. That's right, the shift.
Yeah, I mean, I take it it's just partly that he saw more in retrospect the success of that prudent statesmanship. And he knows that Lincoln deserves substantial credit for emancipation. Whatever was being done by the slaves to achieve their own emancipation, and I don't discount that, but that would have been unavailing if you had not had federal action. Remember, those fleeing slaves had to have somewhere to flee. They fled behind Union lines. Freedom followed the advance of those federal troops. And
so much after the war depended on the fact that those Black troops fought. That required federal action to welcome them into the armed forces of the United States. So I think that Douglass really wanted his people to understand the importance of law. And the monument itself is a kind of testament to that. You have both the importance of an individual, a particular individual, a wise leader, but you also have the embodiment of that in law, in that paper, that written paper.
Thank you. Darwin Garcia asks, can we compare MLK to Douglass?
Yes, there are many ways in which they are similar. I think they are most similar in their fundamentally integrationist vision. Douglass believes that there will come a time, he actually predicts the emergence of a kind of composite American race, that there will be a sort of blending of the races. If you could actually get to the point where we don't pay so much attention to color, then affection would just follow its natural dictates, and eventually the races would be blended. So he has a very radical vision of integration. And that, I think, is what links him most to MLK.
Thank you. Laura Barba asks, is it a myth that Lincoln was a slave owner?
Yes. That answers a myth. That is false. He was never a slaveholder. He was born in a slave state, in Kentucky, but his parents actually were anti-slavery from the beginning. They knew that slavery actually imperiled the situation of poor whites. It made labor, discreditable. So his family left the slave state, moving first to Indiana and then to Illinois.
There was a follow-up question from Laura. Do you know how that myth came about that Lincoln was a slave owner?
I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, there's lots of things like that out there. It is true that many of the founding fathers were slave owners. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, right? All of those Virginians were slaveholders, but no, never Lincoln.
Thank you. Christina Flores asks, what is your opinion on the BLM movement and how systemic racism is still very much prevalent in society today?
Yeah, I tried to touch on that just briefly at the end there by saying something about what I think is the difference between Douglass's approach and at least some of the contemporary approach. Douglass lived in a time when there was systemic racism. I mean, first there was slavery, and then there was discrimination and Jim Crow and lynching, and he lived during that time. He was very familiar with the systemic aspects. He called out, the convict lease system, the convict labor system. He called out debt peonage and sharecropping, those things that sprang up after the war. So he was very interested in dismantling those structures. But at the same time that he noted those things, he always stressed that America was not in its essence racist. He regarded the founding, those founding principles as true, and he didn't think that the founders were simply hypocritical. I'm sorry, can you guys hear that crying puppy in the background here? Let me just get up a moment and shut the door here and see if I can block out that sound. We just got a new 8-week-old puppy 3 days ago. All right, so back to these serious matters. So I'm very worried that the turn against the nation's founding will actually imperil progress in addressing the continued existence of serious issues. So I think Douglass is a model for how to do that, how to condemn the wrongs of current practice, while at the same time celebrating the nation's ideals and trying to, remediate that gap between the ideals and the practices.
This is a question. I know this is one of the professors, but I think we'll allow it. Jose Bocanera, did Douglas know Reconstruction was on its last leg?
Oh yeah, he did. Yeah, by 76, it was already clear. So I do think the speech shows great sensitivity to the current moment. He's trying to do what he can to use that memory of Lincoln to counteract the worsening situation. And one speech can't accomplish that. And we know that things get much worse in the 1880s and in the 1890s. By the way, I did want to show everybody the picture of Frederick Douglass that I have behind me. This is from Harper's Weekly, and the date that it has on it is 1883. Douglass gave a very important speech in 1883 in response to the Supreme Court decision that struck down the 1875 Civil Rights Act. Okay, so the first Civil Rights Act was actually in 1875, implementing the 14th and 15th Amendments. And by 1883, the Supreme Court had turned against that. That will, of course, reach its culmination with the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, where the Supreme Court upholds segregation, upholds the separate but equal idea. So that picture right there is from that time period in that speech.
Just I guess a bit of a follow-up from Professor Bocanera. How did Reconstruction affect Douglas's attitude toward Lincoln, and would Douglas have had a less sanguine view of Lincoln earlier rather than later during Reconstruction?
Yeah, good. Actually, I think the turn for Douglas comes with the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. So before the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, if you read his editorials from the very early years of the war, I mean, he doesn't trust Lincoln yet, and he just thinks everything is moving too slowly. But once that Emancipation Proclamation is issued, January 1st, 1863, midnight, when Lincoln delivers on that, from then forward, his tone really changes. And I think also, his personal meetings with Lincoln had an effect. So remember, the final Emancipation Proclamation welcomes Blacks into the armed services, and Douglas took the lead in organizing recruitment for the 54th and 55th Massachusetts. His own sons served in those regiments. Douglas then met with Lincoln to complain about the lower pay that the Black recruits received, and also to push for Blacks to be allowed to serve as officers. So initially there were no Black officers. They were the Black troops were commanded by white officers. So Douglas meets with Lincoln, and he doesn't quite get satisfaction on that issue. Lincoln, again, is having to kind of accommodate public opinion and the resistance remember, New York draft riots break out because whites are upset about the Emancipation Proclamation. They don't want to serve in a war if the purpose of the war is now emancipation rather than saving the Union. But I think Douglas became convinced of Lincoln's sincerity and really grew to trust him. And eventually the pay was equalized. And by the very end of the war, there were the first Black officers. He also met with Lincoln again when it looked like Lincoln was not going to win re-election. In 1864, times were very dark. Lincoln didn't think there was any chance he was going to be reelected. But he wanted to make sure that as many slaves made their way north and made their way behind Union lines, because Lincoln was fearful if he wasn't reelected, then a peace Democrat would be elected, and that meant there would be a negotiated end to the war and basically probably the reinstitution of slavery. So it really mattered to get as many slaves as possible behind Union lines. Lincoln believed that if they were once free, it would be very difficult to re-enslave them. And he actually talked with Douglas about a plan to basically do what John Brown wanted to do, and go, kind of, behind enemy lines and organize the flight of slaves toward freedom, to make the words of the Emancipation Proclamation a reality, and to make it faster. Now, once the situation looked better, it wasn't necessary to implement that plan. The Union troops themselves started to achieve the victories necessary to make the Emancipation Proclamation a reality.
Thank you. Darwin Garcia asks, is it true that Lincoln could have joined with Washington due to their similarities in freedom? I'm not quite sure of the question. Is it true that Lincoln is similar to Washington due to their? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure what that means either. But yes, there certainly are great links between Washington and Lincoln, and not least that one of the first books Lincoln had was Parson Weems's biography of Washington, and he studied that. He was very familiar with the farewell address, Washington's farewell address. I think it informed a lot of his own statesmanship and understanding of America.
Okay. Francisco Bezon asks, if Douglas wasn't born, would it have been more difficult for Lincoln to be seen as an ally or a friend to the Blacks at that time?
No, that's interesting. Well, that's a counterfactual we don't even want to think about, because we certainly want Frederick Douglass to have been born. But I believe that the Black response to Lincoln doesn't really depend on Frederick Douglass. This very sophisticated assessment of Lincoln does. But in fact, the greater danger was probably that Lincoln was regarded as the Black Moses by the freed slaves. And you can pick this up from someone like Booker T. Washington, who was born into slavery and was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation when he was 9 years old. And he says he remembers his mother's morning prayers, which were always for President Lincoln and for the success of Union arms. And he says that after the war, basically there was God, Lincoln, and freedom. Almost a new trinity, God the Father, Lincoln the Son, and freedom the Holy Spirit. And Booker T, who lived in the South, and he said that there was a time when every Black family would have had a picture of Lincoln on the wall, and Blacks voted for the Republican Party until the shift over to voting for the Democratic Party, but that doesn't happen until the 20th century. So yeah, I think that would have existed very much without Frederick Douglass. In fact, you could say part of what I tried to argue, at least, part of what Douglass is doing in this speech is maybe tempering the Black appreciation of Lincoln a little bit. You don't want people to look to political figures as sainted. So there's that very careful calibration of praise and blame. I think the balance of what Douglass does ends up on the side of praise, but he, this just kind of reiterates what I said in the speech, but he does level some of those points of dissatisfaction.
Right. Miguel Martinez asks, what was Douglass's view on the need for Blacks to serve as officers in the war to serve a better future for them once free?
Yeah, good. He certainly wanted that. He pushed for that. He wanted full equality and the recognition of that full equality. So yeah, I think he thought that was important, but I do think he thought the most important thing was simply that they serve. And I believe the reason he thought it was so important is because there was a kind of, impression that because of long enslavement, that meant, you weren't willing to fight for your freedom, you were cowardly, and that impression had to be decisively refuted. And bravery in battle is a decisive refutation of that. Douglass, I think, also believed that service in the war would provide the grounds for a claim upon citizenship. Right? Remember, there's a natural right to liberty. Right? Slavery is wrong, liberty must be vindicated. But the claim to citizenship is a different kind of claim. It's not a natural claim. It's, a claim that has to be made based on, either nativity or contribution, or, those who are already citizens have to decide to make other people citizens. And so Douglass believed that service in the Civil War would strengthen that claim to citizenship. And remember, Frederick Douglass is one of the prime movers in the 15th Amendment. The suffrage amendment.
Thank you. Professor Hutchins had a question she wanted to get in here.
I do. You've answered one of my questions. I found myself making a lot of notes and a lot of great phrases. But since our topic today focuses so much on gratitude, I think we all join in being grateful for being your students today. But I did want to offer a personal note of gratitude for what so proudly we hail. Dr. Smith first directed me to the website some months ago, and we enjoyed it. And the book is just terrific. I ordered the book, and it's just the most marvelous resource. And I hope you'll pass on that appreciation to your co-editors.
Thank you.
Anyway,
thank you so much, Debbie.
Okay, I had a question. This is such a strong, gripping phrase, this blood bought freedom.
Yeah.
And that was so striking to me. And I think to the opening of the speech, when I first started reading the speech, I thought, okay, what was Douglass saying to the people of his day, and what is he saying? What does he have to say to us, to the people of the future?
Mm-hmm.
And he mentions the complacency of the future. And since it's come up about the monument and about how that monument was funded, it's hard for me to think of those freed slaves giving their nickels for the first time to build a monument to Lincoln. Do you at all see that related to this complacency that Douglass fears we'll have in the future? Maybe complacency about the shoulders we stand on, if nothing else.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it does seem to me just an incredible act of ingratitude to even be thinking about removing that monument in terms of what it was.
I think we've lost sound.
Yeah. Diana.
Oh, sorry. I don't know what happened there. Did you hear any of what I said, or should I just start over?
Yes, if you could maybe run through that again. Most of it I could see it and not hear it.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. It is an act of ingratitude, and it involves a kind of forgetting, right? A forgetting of the past, and really a failure of the historical imagination. We are so involved in our, being anti-racists, right, that we don't really see what it would have meant in an earlier era to be that, and to appreciate that. So even though we don't like the optics of that Emancipation Memorial, right? Because it shows, I don't know, I guess the notion is that it's the great white father, standing above the passive slave. And so that's the objection. Maybe I could be allowed just to give my reading of the statute to try.
That would be terrific, especially for those of us who haven't seen it. Do you have an image you can?
Let me see if I do. I think I can bring up here I got one earlier today of it. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, can you all see that now?
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's the Emancipation Memorial. Maybe I need to move this down. Let me see. So there you can see the foot of it. So let me just say what I think this is. The title is Emancipation, and that's crucial. The monument is not a depiction of freedom. It's a depiction of the transition to freedom. And that change of status is made possible by the executive order, right? He's holding the Emancipation Proclamation there. And I think that the statute actually captures something true about this in-between state. In other words, the freed man, the former slave, now free, the freed man is not yet a free man in full, right? And so he's pictured, he's not kneeling and he's not standing. He's kind of half rising. He's in the process of rising. He's poised on the brink of possibility. So the statute, I think, acknowledges that emancipation by law, right, by just, an executive decree, that's only the beginning. It's the beginning of an arduous journey. And note, the freedman is not looking up at Lincoln. He's not beseeching Lincoln. He's not worshiping Lincoln. He's not looking at Lincoln at all. Right? He's not a supplicant. His gaze is fixed forward, eyes on the prize, we might say. He sees the vast future ahead for himself and for his people. So his widened horizon comes as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, but he's intent on his own self-realization. He is intent on his own agency. I think there are some other elements that ought to be noted here. I mean, most of the dissatisfaction centers on the figure of the slave, but there are other elements here. There's the plinth. That contains symbols of the nation. You see the cameo of George Washington there. You see the shield and the stars. Those represent law, government. They represent the founding. Behind Lincoln, you can't see it from this view, but behind Lincoln, there is a whipping post. And the whipping post is covered over in a kind of drapery. So the artist is reminding us there is an old way, that way of slavery, and there is the new way. Right? And enslaved people lived under the lash. A free people is going to live under law. And in moving from one order to the other, we don't forget the horrors of the past, right? Or its lingering legacy. I think that's the significance of sort of what's behind the drapery. And the statute tries to be honest about that, right? That it's not all over in an instant. So in celebrating the new birth of freedom, we're not denying the nation's injustice. Right? We're trying to keep both of those in our minds. And so even though the chain has been broken, I don't know if you can see it, but the chain has been broken, but the cuffs are still on his wrists. So the new order of the law allows for the freeman to rise, but the effort to wrench himself away from his former constrained condition, that's going to be his. It's going to be ongoing, a struggle. And his fists are clenched and his muscles are straining. Right? He is participating in his rise. And then, there's Lincoln himself. And I think the point is it's not only law, but it is, a good man and wise leadership are the ultimate source of good laws. And Frederick Douglass certainly emphasizes that point in the oration when he keeps saying, under his rule, we saw. So there are people who think that the statute is just visually irredeemable, but I think we need to learn how to read statutes better. You know, we need more history. We need we need acts of the historical imagination, and we need kind of the knowledge of the aesthetics of memorialization.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's fantastic. So yeah, you definitely wouldn't be for ripping it down or moving it. Would you want to alter it in any way?
Well, actually, what I would do, and I think this is suggested by what Douglass himself said in a newspaper piece after his speech, where he did sort of indicate, this is not his favorite depiction. And he sort of says, I hope the time will come when we get further depictions, right, of this era and of Black achievement. So what I would do is follow the gaze of Alexander Archer. That's the name of the actual former slave who was the model for that depiction. If you follow his gaze, you should throughout Lincoln Park have commemorations of all of the avenues and realms of Black achievement.
Wow. Yeah, that would be
and,
fantastic.
Art, literature, politics, sports, whatever, right? There should be a whole field of statuary. That was the beginning. It never said it was everything. That was the beginning. And where does it lead? That would be I think the proper thing to do. Wow. More statues.
That's a great vision. And I have a mental image of something that might look a little like Statuary Hall in the Capitol, but
right.
Of the great figures.
Yeah. And so, we need more statues of Frederick Douglass. We need more statues of the, the Black soldiers and abolitionists and, everything from the beginning forward.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. No, I mean, this is fantastic, right? So Douglass, as a teacher of democratic statesmanship, he sees the accomplishments, the complexities of Lincoln, and is able to display that or unveil that for a general audience at a public ceremony. That's fantastic. No, that really is great. I guess one of the things that he strikes me as such a magnanimous man. I actually was kind of, when you said you had some Aristotle to throw in there, I would have liked to have heard that. If you have a condensed version of that, I'd like to hear that. And then two, gratitude is a difficult one. And I'm always reminded of the sort of joke, you get the spoiled child who's told to eat his spinach because they're starving children in other parts of the world, and then there's a spoiled child, spits back, send them the spinach, right? Gratitude is a hard thing to teach, I guess, because you have to listen and you have to have the real imagination to understand it. But I feel like I've learned from it, but doing it is I guess another measure. Between those two.
And it's maybe always hard, as the virtues are, but it's maybe especially hard in a regime that's based on a teaching about rights. Because if you have rights, well, you're entitled. They're yours, and other people better grant them. And you don't have to thank them when they do it. Douglass is certainly a rights thinker. I think he's in the natural rights tradition, but he is in a way making certain corrections or additions to that rights framework. And one of his additions is that he sort of says you really got to prove yourself worthy of what's your due. Of course, everybody has a natural right to liberty, but you're really going to have to vindicate that. You have to earn it. And he believes that this is important for Blacks to realize because they live in a nation that was founded in a revolutionary act where people risked their lives for liberty. And he thinks Americans won't respect anybody who's not prepared to do that. So I think he thinks it's generally true that rights can't be given, they have to be sort of taken. But he thinks it's especially true in the American case. So you've got to prove yourself worthy of what's due to you, just as a human being. And then second, you have to express gratitude towards others for granting you what is your due. And that's also a tough teaching. It seems in a way like a violation of equality. And if I'm entitled to my rights, you're obliged to give them to me, and I don't owe you anything for doing that. That's just simple justice. But Douglass, I think, is trying to make these expressions of gratitude sort of part of equal citizenship, and trying to cultivate that. And it really is interesting that, this guy who is such an activist, probably about a third of his speeches are on commemorative occasions, where he is expressing gratitude, marking progress, and expressing gratitude to whomever that gratitude, he thinks is due. So the two speeches that he includes in the final version of his autobiography, he only, he gave hundreds of speeches, and he puts two of them in the appendix of the final version of his autobiography. It's this speech that we talked about tonight, the oration in memory of Abraham Lincoln, and it's a speech that he gave on the anniversary of West Indian independence. And that speech is really an acknowledgement of the British abolitionists and the way in which the British abolitionists took the lead in the freedom struggle.
One thing that occurred to me in listening to what you said and what Dr. Smith said before you is when we think about gratitude, certainly in a pre-Enlightenment way, we can think about how it contributes to human flourishing, and our contemporary happiness studies show us, in fact, that's correct. Being able to, in spite of the fact that, yes, sorry, I'm a Madisonian here. I'm all for the natural rights view in many ways. But that is hard to be grateful to someone for acknowledging your rights in some way or respecting your rights. But that if we could cultivate, I think maybe Douglass knew the extreme experiences of his life, that that was part of what it would mean for him to flourish in his freedom and maybe have happiness. Do you think?
Yeah, I think that's very nice. I don't know how much Aristotle Douglass read, but he was a kind of natural Aristotelian, and he understood a lot about human flourishing. And he's always paying attention to kind of, the freedom, not just as a political phenomenon or a kind of external phenomenon, but as an internal phenomenon. And gratitude and these other, he calls them, the noble virtues. And that is essential to that. Yeah, he's a great aspirant to nobility, and really, Brian's mention of the magnanimous man, Douglass really is a model of that magnanimous man.
Yeah, and a model of it, right? He looks the part. He speaks the part. He just displays. It's incredible. All his actions, his life. It's just remarkable. It's 4:35. Some students have had to leave. So I think what we should do is wrap it up. Although I would love to ask more questions. I think this has been fantastic, and I really appreciate it. We are grateful. for this. It's been
Thank you.
fantastic. It's been a fantastic event for Black History Month, and it's been a fantastic event for South Texas College. So on behalf of South Texas College and myself, thank you very much, Mr. Shaw.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you all.